Hey folks, got another build for you. This build is my 2024 update of a concept I first developed in 2021, so it's a build that is 3 years in the making. I've got a link in the description to the first time I posted about this concept during early access on Reddit, long before I had a YouTube channel. Back then it was hands down the most powerful build of early access, and it remained one of the most powerful builds. I'd say once Helm of Grit Berserker Barbarian entered the meta with early access patch 7, that one kind of overtook it, but still it was in the top 3 for pretty much all of early access. When full release finally dropped in 2024, I discussed the same build, how it would translate to full release in an underwatched early video, and I made a post about that for the BG3 build subreddit. At the time, that subreddit was really needing content, and I like the folks there, so I decided not to make a full video for the build, but just to leave it as a Reddit post, and I'm kind of glad I did, because now it's 2024, and the build has developed a lot. There's a lot to talk about. In my opinion, it's back to being one of the top performing builds in the game, so let's dive in. So, just as a quick guide, the Retaliation Wizard is an Abjuration Wizard 11 Draconic Sorcerer 1 build that uses retaliation damage spells to kill enemies by deliberately proccing attacks of opportunity. Besides doing top tier single target and AoE damage, it's also an S tier controller and support, bringing some of the most valuable defensive buffs to your team composition. By late game, it literally does it all. For some of you, that's enough information for you to be able to execute the concept. I've linked a detailed spreadsheet of the build in the description. It includes a leveling guide, stats, and items. However, if you'd like to hear my rationale for making the build and my honest thoughts about how it performs, keep listening. I want to start by talking about why wizards are mandatory, because for me at least, I consider 11 levels of either wizard or sorcerer to be mandatory for every run. This build is designed to fill that slot in the party, so let's discuss why. The short version is that at all points of the game, some of the most run-deciding strategies are enabled by these two classes, Wizard and Sorcerer. Let's start with the early game. In the early game, Wizards and Sorcerers get the spells Sleep and Cloud of Daggers, and they also get access to the Quasit Pet Shovel. Sleep and Cloud of Daggers are different in execution, but valuable for basically the same reason. That reason is that they offer a potent effect that mostly bypasses RNG. Sleep is an early game sleep condition with no saving throw to resist. Absolutely invaluable. Cloud of Daggers is simply the best AoE damage spell for a level 2 spell slot. I mean, hell, it's the best AoE damage spell for a level 3 spell slot. Fireball does not even come close to competing despite what people say. Both eventually fall off, but practically all of my early game strategies revolve around these two spells. Now on to Shovel. Shovel is a Quasit familiar that has an at-will invisibility power. You can use this to consistently and reliably get surprise rounds on your enemy, similar to the Durgar racial power. Only it's actually better than the Durgar racial power because there are some forced dialogue encounters where a Durgar cannot get surprised, but Shovel can. At the very start of Act 2, we get access to the Hat of Fire acuity, which unlocks the Wizard and Sorcerer's mid-game strategy. Haste yourself, preferably with a pot, cast Scorching Ray to stack Arcane acuity, and then cast an AoE control spell to CC as many enemies as possible. Glyph of Warding and Sleet Storm are almost always the best options for crowd control, but there are other options like Hypnotic Pattern or Fear that can be just as good depending on the situation. You can't use this combo every encounter, but having it for boss fights is crucial for the mid-game. Finally, when we get into late game, which is Act 3, besides still having the Fire Acuity strat and Shovel, these never fall off in value, Wizards and Sorcs get access to the spell Globe of Invulnerability at level 11. It's probably the single most impactful use of an action in the game. Are you about to get wrecked by Anzur's 18 die 10 Stormheart Nova? Globe of Invulnerability completely counters it, no RNG. Steel Watcher gonna explode? Globe of Invulnerability. For Mind Flayers fixing to spam you with 6 level upcasted magic missiles? Globe of Invulnerability. Channeling Netherstones to ice the Elder Brain? Globe of Invulnerability. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can still beat these encounters without it, but why even risk it? Globe of Invulnerability secures you the victory with, and I cannot stress this enough, no RNG! Getting all of these strategies in a single package is just too valuable. I have never completed a run of this game where I didn't have one build that filled this role. But 11 levels of either Sorcerer or Wizard still leaves a lot of options open for how to best build the unit. The Retaliation Wizard is one option, and I suspect it may be the best overall. Alright, let's dive into the core synergies now. If this is the first of my build videos you've watched, I prefer to explore builds by focusing on the core synergies that make the build work, rather than just going level by level. If you want a level by level guide, see the spreadsheet linked in the description. As I said above, the core strategy of this build is to kill enemies through the use of retaliation damage spells. So let's start by looking at those. The first and only spell of this kind that a wizard gets access to is Fire Shield. It's a level 4 spell. It is a 10 round personal buff, concentration free, that will deal 2d8 retaliation damage to melee attacks that hit you. It also gives resistance to a damage type, but that really does not matter to us because we're going to have Warding Bond on us. The retaliation damage can either be fire or cold, and of course we want cold because of the easier opportunity to double it against wet targets. 2d8 will average 9 damage, 18 against wet targets, not very good, but it's a start. By far the best retaliation effect in the game is the spell Armor of Agathis. Usually it is a Warlock exclusive spell, but you can get it through the White Draconic Sorcerer subclass, which is why we do take a 1 level dip in Sorcerer. This spell is very cool. It gives you 5 temporary hit points that last until your next long rest for each spell level that you cast it. It will also deal 5 cold retaliation damage for each spell level. This will proc on each melee hit for as long as you maintain the temporary hit point shield. Mathematically minded listeners, or just folks who've watched my spell tier list video series, will know that the value you get from upcasting this is just insane. I mean, compared to most spells, it is overloaded. It's increasing both the damage and the temp HP shield, which creates like a scaling loop, right? The higher the shield you have, the more procs of the damage you are likely to get, and also the more damage you're likely to get on each proc. When upcasted with a 6th level spell slot, Armor of Agathis grants 30 temporary HP and deals 30 cold damage each melee hit, 60 against wet targets. That is RNG free, right? As long as they hit you, you get that proc of 30, 60 if they're wet. That is a lot of damage, but how many procs are we likely to get? That's always the big problem with this spell. 30 temporary HP late game is not going to last very long, right? A typical melee unit will likely average above 15 damage a hit, but below 30, so we can expect 2 procs of Armor of Agathis damage under typical circumstances. 2 procs is not very much. However, if we stack damage reduction, we can get more procs, and that is when the Abjuration School wizard takes center stage. Abjuration wizards get the subclass feature Arcane Ward. I love this thing. Arcane Ward is a stacking buff that the wizard gets. Each stack of Arcane Ward will reduce damage dealt to you by 1 automatically. And each time you take damage, you will lose 1 stack, and they otherwise last until your next long rest. So the only way to really lose them is either by using them to mitigate damage or resting. After each long rest, you will reset to a number of stacks equal to your wizard level. You can acquire more stacks by casting abjuration spells, gaining 1 stack for each spell level you use to cast the abjuration spell. The maximum number of stacks is equal to twice your wizard level. At 6th level, you gain the ability to use Arcane Ward to shield allies from damage as a reaction, and then at 10th level, you gain the ability to increase your stacks when you short rest, adding your wizard level to the pool each short rest, okay? It sounds noodly when I'm just saying it like this, but it's really quite straightforward in game. It's flat damage reduction for both you and your party when you use your reaction, and that it's flat damage that scales exceptionally well with your wizard level. You will also get more damage reduction the more abjuration spells you cast. That's great because there are several S-tier abjuration spells every wizard wants to cast anyways. Spells like Shield, Counterspell, Glyph of Warding, and then for us, Armor of Agathis. We can get even more flat damage reduction and retaliation damage from items if we wear the Bone Spike Garb. I love this robe set, I talked about it in my last video. Bonespike Garb will net us 2 more flat damage reduction and add 6 piercing damage to our Retaliation damage pool if we combine it with the Amulet of Greater Health, which I recommend. If we stop and take stock for a moment, max Arcane Ward stacks at 11 wizard levels is 22. With Bonespike Garb, that is 24 flat damage reduction. Assuming we use the full amount of damage reduction each hit, we will mitigate 297 damage before we run out of Arcane Ward stacks, and that is if we never cast a single Abjuration spell or take a short rest. Assuming we use the full amount of damage reduction each hit, we will mitigate 297 damage before we run out of Arcane Ward stacks, and that is assuming we never take a short rest. Each short rest will add an additional 88 more damage mitigation. Combine all of that flat damage reduction with someone in your party who can cast Warding Bond, and we effectively reduce most damage against us to 0. This is because, as I've said a few times before, the percentage damage reduction of resistances will apply before the flat damage reduction of Arcane Ward, giving us much more mileage from Arcane Ward, which in turn will give us near infinite mileage from Armor of Agathys. If a target hits us and we reduce their damage dealt to 0, it will still proc Armor of Agathys, in which case they will be spending their action economy to do nothing but hurt themselves. The only problem with all of this is that AI can actually tell that an attack against you is a waste, and they will straight up do nothing at all on their turns if it means not attacking you. For example, in this fight against Mystic Carrion's Undead Horde, I body blocked the doorway with my Retaliation Wizard Gale. The blocked enemies couldn't attack anyone but him, so they responded by refusing to act altogether. That's what we call a win-win. I just shot them with arrows, and the encounter was neutralized. Still, not all fights have doorways, so we need some way to force enemies to attack us. The only true way to do this is to deliberately provoke attacks of opportunity. The AI will always take the attack if they can get it. Another way I explored, which turned out not working, but is still worth discussing, is through the legendary Rapier Duelist Prerogative. Duelist Prerogative is a strange weapon that synergizes surprisingly well with this build. Among the things it gives you is the Challenge to Duel ability. On a bonus action, a single target must make a Wisdom saving throw against your weapon action DC. If they fail, they have disadvantage attacking any target that is not you. This can sometimes provoke enemies to attack you or ignore your enemies, but it's not really reliable. I'm embarrassed to say when I planned this build, I assumed Challenge to Duel worked like the Paladin spell Compelled Duel just because they had the same icon, and Compelled Duel is supposed to force enemies to attack you. I was really disappointed when I learned that's not how it worked, and I'm kind of embarrassed because I think I covered Duelist Prerogative in a top 10 weapons video of Act 3. Did I get that wrong or did I just forget? Anyways, the cheap price of a bonus action to cast this ability can make it still worth it, right? You are still giving disadvantage on all of their attacks that they make towards your allies. Besides Challenge to Duel, Duelist Prerogative also gives you an extra reaction, which is nifty for us. With abilities like Project Arcane Ward, Counterspell, and Shield, we have a lot of uses of our reaction, very efficient uses. So even though the taunt isn't a real taunt, Duelist Prerogative is still a decent weapon choice. If the two reactions don't impress you though, we have a few other decent options. You could go Trident of Waves to moisten up your enemies, which will double your cold retaliation damage. I mean, you want to be having a consistent way to spread the wet condition, but I prefer to spread it through the Water Myrmidon summon, in which case the Trident of Waves is superfluous. Marco Heshker is also good for wizards. It's just good for all wizard builds. And at least in theory, Frost of Dark Winter should add our proficiency bonus to the cold damage we deal in Retaliation. That could be really good, but I haven't really tested it though, so if you try it, let me know how it works in the comments. My favorite choice for weapons though is to go Bloodthirst and Crimson Mischief. Besides doing great DPR for low investment, Bloodthirst will also make targets vulnerable to piercing retaliation damage, which we will deal through Bonespike Garb, so it actually gets us a little more damage, and then it also buffs all the piercing damage of your team composition. Overall, I think the best option. Using higher damage weapons like Duelist Prerogative or Bloodthirst and Crimson Mischief are preferred because we also want to be casting haste on ourselves. Haste doubles our movement, and more movement means provoking attacks of opportunity from more targets. Then we'll also get an extra attack per round as a bonus, so nice. Since we were just talking about weapons, I threw together this quick, very rudimentary DPR calculation to give you the kind of idea of the damage you can output in Act 3 once you've got all your items and everything, and also to compare Duelist Prerogative with Bloodthirst and Crimson Mischief. This will be in the spreadsheet that I've linked in the description. There'll be a leveling guide, an equipment guide, and then I've added a DPR tab here. So as you can see, in terms of damage, Bloodthirst and Crimson Mischief is significantly better than Duelist Prerogative. The advantage of Duelist Prerogative is that you get the potential taunt, and you get the utility of having an extra reaction. Now, which is more valuable, having an extra reaction or dealing more damage and potentially increasing your team's damage? That is up to you to decide, but I think both are good choices. I definitely prefer Bloodthirst Crimson Mischief, even though I actually played the build with Duelist Prerogative. But against a 19 AC enemy, which is the kind of AC that you're going to encounter late game, you can see with Bloodthirst and Crimson Mischief, you'll be dealing around 53.4 damage on average, and that's just from your attacks. By the way, that is assuming you are hasted. So if you spend your action, your haste action, and then your offhand. Now remember, this is just persistent damage. If you actually want to go Nova and deal burst damage, you are a wizard. So you'll have access to Curriculum of Strategy and stuff like that, Cone of Cold, Chain Lightning. You can do spells like that to really do a lot of damage. This is just the kind of damage you deal on average persistently in a low resource combat. Then there is the retaliation damage. I added together a Bonespike Garb, Armor of Agathis, and a 4th level cast of Fire Shield. Here is how much damage they will average standard, and how much damage they will average against vulnerable targets. Most likely, targets will be vulnerable at least to Armor of Agathis and Fire Shield. This extra 6 damage you get from vulnerability to Bonespike Garb is, of course, only if you are using Bloodthirst, and only against the target that you attack with Bloodthirst. Still, if you're dealing around 80 to 90 damage to every target that you proc an attack of opportunity against, which is a lot of targets when you're hasted, and that is all from your movement. You still have your action, your haste action, and your bonus action to deal an additional 53. You can see we are dealing in the realm of hundreds of damage, and this is on a class that still has the Hat of Fire acuity for landing crowd control, that still has, like I said, spells like Curriculum of Strategy, Cone of Cold, Globe of Invulnerability, just all around an exceptional late game build. And that's it. That is my Retaliation Wizard build. Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget, there is a level by level spreadsheet guide linked in the description that might answer some of your questions. Last time I got a lot of questions in the comments that had answers in the spreadsheet, so maybe check that out if you have a question. Also, while you're in the description, if you want to see some BG3 history, check out the links to the older versions of this build and see how it's developed. Thanks for watching, everybody. I will catch you next time.